Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Everyday Anarchism. I'm your host, Graham Culbertson. For this episode, I revived the old tradition of starting chatting with my guest and never doing an introduction. So here's the introduction. My guest today is Meredith Veldman, and we're here to talk about her book, Fantasy, the Bomb, and the Greening of Britain, which is to say, a book that explains the connections between the Romantic tradition and then the anti-war movement of the second half of the 20th century. And then in between talks about the work of these counterculture and yet also deeply conservative romantics, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. And as you know, Tolkien and his connections to William Morris and conservative anarchism are of deep interest to me. So that's what Meredith and I talk about, although we start talking about the way that colleges and universities are meant to run in a guild style, in an anarchic style, without traditional hierarchies and bosses and managers, but they don't anymore. So here's that conversation coming up after the music. One of the things that has struck me about this journey into anarchism and the idea that someone like Tolkien would be an anarchist, and of course, when you read his letters, which I've just done recently, he is just constantly bitching about everything. But the idea that college, it comes from colleagues. It is the idea that the people, it's an old guild idea, maybe never actually really existed, but had the idea that the people who run the institution and the people who do the work of the institution are the same people. And that just runs all through Kropotkin's work in his definition of anarchy. So when you think of Oxford, and I just visited Oxford for the first time recently, and you look at it as an absolute bastion of power and privilege, it's the furthest thing from anarcho-communism. Mm-hmm. But if you think of it as internally, as a bunch of people who have, hierarchies, and some of them are professors and some of them are not professors. And I, as an American, I don't understand this, but supposedly there's not a CEO and a CFO who come from a different class. Supposedly it is a corporate body. In that sense, Oxford is in some ways the ideal Tory or conservative anarchist institution. I don't know. Yeah. Is that ridiculous?
That makes absolute sense. And it makes so much sense that Tolkien, except for a little time at Leeds, spent, pretty much his life there. Same thing, with C.S. Lewis, because it was this little oasis away from the world that was out there. And to a remarkable degree remains today. I mean, what we're supposed to, American universities, faculty is supposed to be in charge. And it's strange, in conversations with administrators and even other faculty to have to say, you do recognize I'm not your employee.
Yeah.
And, their shock, and increasingly, certainly at LSU, that we're listed as employees. And it's like, actually, we're not. This is different,
Yeah, it's this. I mean, so first of all, I should say I am a teaching professor. So that means I mean, I don't know. It's sort of so regular. I don't know if the word would be what used to would have been called staff. They have to at UNC track their hours, and even if there's various rules about how supervisor you are, and the hours are tracked differently. And I am faculty member in the sense that my hours are not tracked in that way. My benefits are handled differently. But yeah, I mean, I'm constantly filling out paperwork where it says, put the name of your supervisor here. And I just want to explain to someone that the chair of the English department is a democratically elected member of the corporate body, is not my supervisor. But no one knows that.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. And it is happening even at Oxford, in the UK, ever since Thatcher. a real kind of state managed bureaucratization. And I know even at Oxford, they have to account for their time weekly.
Oh.
How much time spent researching, how much time, which I think I do modern Britain. Do I count the hours I spend watching British television?
Oh, Meredith, you are so already speaking my language, because this is precisely what I mean when I'm talking about everyday anarchism. Is, when people are like, so James C. Scott has been a huge influence on me
Oh,
lately,
okay.
and
Yeah.
this idea of seeing like a state. And so if like the
Uh-huh.
question is like, what do you want to do? Let's say educate young people. All right. Well, step one would be draw up some spreadsheets of what you want the education to be, and then assess your resources for what you are doing for education. So, for example, again, to speak for my own life, my contract says it's 80% teaching, 20% service, 0% research. Is making this podcast or my other podcast that I make that is actually for the department, is that research? Is it service? It doesn't make any sense. You
No, no.
cannot divide my job into 80-20-0. It's nonsense. But if you go to these rooms and say like, look, I work hard. I do my best. Frankly, I work too hard. I wish I actually spent more time relaxing instead of always thinking and reading and emailing students and doing independent studies, and I don't have time for. Can you just leave me alone and I will do my job? And there's like,
Yeah,
no,
right.
we need please give us the report on how you spent 80% of your
Yeah,
time,
right.
and then another report on how you spent 20% of your time.
Right. The joy of assessment and all that.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Do you know the work of E.F. Schumacher?
So actually, no, I don't know the work of E.F. Schumacher. Although Schumacher has come up recently as I've been looking at things, but no, I don't know the work of E.F. Schumacher.
He, interesting guy. So he's in that book of mine, and a German immigrant to England. Kind of, I guess we call him an early green, but he's been really influential for me. One of the things that he argues is there are divergent problems and convergent problems, and convergent problems are those: if we get the math right, if we get the science right, if we get the data right, we will find the answer. You know, how to make a good video recorder, right? There was Betamax, now we know. No, that kind of thing, right? And he uses education as an example of a divergent problem. That no matter how much data we get, no matter how many scientists, no matter how many experts, we will never agree on how to educate, because that's not that kind of a problem. And I find that really helpful, as I watch the assessors come in, and I just keep thinking, this isn't a convergent problem, folks. We're never
Yeah.
going to agree.
Okay, so that actually is a great place to start. And so what I'll do, usually I just do a little intro in the episode, but I'll record a separate intro and explain who you are. So first, let me ask, because Schumacher's in this quote, were you aware that your book was recently mentioned in the London Review of Books? Because that's how I found out about it.
No, my goodness,
All right.
definitely not.
So let's see. Let me pull this up. So Tahila Sasson, I don't know how to say that name, wrote a book called The Solidarity Economy, Nonprofits, and the Making of Neoliberalism After Empire. And it was reviewed by, I believe, a historian named Susan Peterson. And it was, I got to tell you, I'm sorry, Tahila, but it was not a positive review from Susan Peterson. I haven't read the book. I have no investment in this book. But let me read to you the final paragraph of this review. Sasson isn't the first scholar to find Schumacher a fascinating subject and to contextualize him in a new way. In 1994, Meredith Veldman published Fantasy, The Bomb, and the Greening of Britain, which was, like The Solidarity Economy, I have to break in, I guess that's the name of the Sasson book, back to the quote, a book that emerged from a PhD dissertation. As a graduate student at Northwestern, reading The Making of the English Working Class on the train into Evanston, Veldman had the odd feeling that it was somehow the same book as the one she was reading for fun, Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, and in some structures of feeling sense it was. So she used Thompson, Schumacher, and the fantasy novelists to show that post-war oppositional politics and culture repurposed romantic ideals. So there you go. Uh,
Gosh,
and I
that's wow. And I mean Susan Peterson, she's wow, she's a player. So that's great.
All right. Well, so I have been, working on Tolkien in a sort of haphazard way for a few years, ever since David Graeber pointed me to Tolkien's famous, at least among anarchists, claim that he doesn't say he's an anarchist, he says he's a believer in philosophical anarchy or constitutional monarchy. It's so funny. But I've engaged very little in the scholarship on Tolkien for a few reasons. One is I didn't really have the time. I wasn't deeply invested in it. And two, pretty soon, as soon as I start looking at the scholarship of Tolkien, it seems like it tends to go one of two ways. One is like some sort of like philology of Elvish, which let me tell you, I have no interest in. And then some sort of like hero worship thinly disguised as cultural criticism, which I maybe have even less worship in. So I got this reference to this book, and I thought Tolkien as a romantic connected to William Morris. Well, that's what I have been saying for 4 years. I should take a look at this book, and I got it. And it's fantastic. So Meredith, thank you for writing this wonderful book. Thank you to Susan Peterson, I guess, for telling me about it, for using it as an example as great work. And thank you for coming on this show to talk about these issues.
Well, thank you for having me. It's not a book that's had a huge readership, so I'm always delighted to hear someone's read it.
Well, Susan Peterson has read it.
That's
clearly,
right, yeah.
and now I have as well. And I don't think I'll have my students read the whole book, but I'm sure we'll read a few chapters of it. So
Okay.
well, I should say, in 2025, I will assign a few chapters of it. Whether
Right.
gotta be realistic about this. So I was going to start with asking a question about romanticism, but if you want to just explain the broad sweep of the book first, that's really up to you. I'm very relaxed. We can do this however you want.
No. Let's stick to what your
Okay.
main interests are. Yeah.
So let's start with romanticism, which is, romanticism is a slur pretty often, and if you want to, you can capitalize it with an R to make it not a slur. So the romanticism of Ruskin is maybe not a slur, but the lowercase r romanticism, or a romantic view of the Middle Ages, is a slur. I myself am trying to hold on to, capital R and lowercase r of romanticism. I have totally completed my switch from technological in enlightenment progressive to romantic anarchist. So when we and of course I'm a 19th century Americanist, and most of my work was in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. But our most beloved American writers are all in one way or another capital R romantics as well. Melville wasn't very romantic in the odes to truth and beauty and nature sense, but in the reaction to the Enlightenment and as part of the movement and being influenced by people like Emerson, who he thought was overly romantic, and Carlyle and that sort of thing. These are romantic. So the romantic movement it's been very important in my work. I am not as knowledgeable about it in 19th century Britain, although following Tolkien to people like Morris and Ruskin, it's really important. Now I'm talking too much, so tell us, Meredith, when you say romantic in your book and in the context of people like Morris and Ruskin and later Tolkien, what are we talking about when we're talking about romanticism?
Right. It is a tricky term, and I was very hesitant to use it because of that. And it is. I have read a few reviews of my book where they just assume from the beginning that because I'm using the term romantic, I actually am very critical of fantasy literature and the other things. And I just keep thinking, did you read the book? Very strange to me. But yeah, I guess I tend to use capital R for the Romantic movement, 1780 to 1830, the Romantic poets, and lowercase r for what I'm talking about, which is something that, although rooted in that movement, I think, definitely transcends it. And it's not in any way an ideology. I would say it's more a worldview, a set of presuppositions, a kind of attitude, which is why you can find fascist romantics, anarchist romantics, socialist romantics, the whole thing. But I really, the term comes from, the term that for me most symbolizes what I'm talking about is the quest for reintegration, which actually comes from a literary scholar from the 60s, a guy named H.G. Schenck. But I think quest for reintegration is the key here. It's the reintegration of the human being with the natural world. It's the reintegration of the human being with some sort of transcendence, whether that be spiritual world or supernatural, or reintegration of the individual with a powerful community life, and the reintegration of the individual with their labor, their work, the product of their labor, or just their work itself. And all of that as a reaction to the Enlightenment and to the reduction of reality to what we can prove with our senses, to the empirical. Not rejecting the empirical, unlike, certain leaders that we have, but recognizing that that is limited. Also, I would say what I was tracing, a rejection of the Enlightenment, but also a rejection then of the Industrial Revolution, which, of course, in England, Britain as a whole, really is at the same time as the Enlightenment. That's where the British experience is so different, because you've got industrialization in northern England, southern Scotland, coast of Wales, 1740s already. So that those two things come pretty much hand in hand. So rejecting the environmental degradation, again, that reintegration with nature, the urbanization, but much more than that, rejecting the Industrial Revolution's kind of consequences in terms of reducing human beings to what they produce, what they buy, what they sell, the idea of economic man. So you get a real reaction against that. And what I argue is that I call it romantic protest, not only because it's protesting against the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, but also because the main strand in British culture, particularly English, but I would say Scottish as well, is the empirical tradition. The sort of, even on a very popular way, the cult of the amateur in English life, where, if you just have enough common sense and use your head and see reality for it is, you can figure it out, right? Truth is easily accessible to the senses. And then, more in terms of intellectual history, if you think of not just the Enlightenment, go back to the contrast between Newton and Descartes, right? English empiricism versus Cartesian rationalism. Or you can even go all the way back to the Middle Ages, William of Ockham, Roger Bacon, if anyone wants to get into the weeds of intellectual history. But there is this current that, English culture, English intellectual thought is very empirical. And so I see the romantic protest as a kind of countercurrent against that, and coming up in fairly unusual places. I mean, that was my book. But yeah, I would say Tolkien definitely rooted in that, and Tolkien then rooted in the people that we do recognize right away as romantics, whether capital R or not, like Ruskin, like Morris, like Coleridge, people like that.
Okay, great. So briefly, first of all, and this is old hat for anyone who's been listening to this show frequently, but I never know. Some people clearly just listen to one episode. So the word, like anarchist, the word, used positively is used first by Proudhon in France. But when Kropotkin writes his history of anarchism as a modern thing, so he says Lao Tzu is an anarchist, but also that's not precisely what we mean. In the same way that, if you want to, you can find romantics in the 2nd century BC as opposed to empiricists in the 2nd century BC. But if we're confining ourselves to this historical framework of when people are using the word, Kropotkin says it's not the first anarchist isn't Proudhon. The first anarchist is Godwin. So that when if you accept that framing, which I certainly do, that makes anarchism in this modern sense part of the romantic movement. So there's a very, very broad sense of anarchism
Mhm.
that you can apply to everything, and the early Christians were anarchists, and I certainly do. But when you look at it this way, the fact that Tolkien is a romantic and says that he is philosophically inclined to anarchy, it's not a wavy line, it's a straight line from the first anarchist, William Godwin, who is the father of Mary Shelley and the influencer of Percy Shelley. So there, with Percy Shelley, Mary Shelley, we're in capital R romantics right there, and
Mhm.
then Ruskin and Morris right the way through. So this is to call Tolkien an anarchist, to call him a conservative anarchist, if you want to, or a Tory anarchist, but that doesn't fit quite as well. Seems like such a shocking contradiction to so many people, but understood as a romantic anarchist, it's not only not shocking, it seems to me as a straight line. All right, I'm repeating myself, so I'll just say, like, does that sound good? Would you like to say anything about Godwin and Ruskin? I really haven't covered them on the podcast, or should we move on?
I don't know much about Godwin at all. I didn't. He never came up in anything I read of Tolkien's writings, whereas both Ruskin and Morris came up a lot,
Mm-hmm.
and Coleridge. So those were the ones I focused on. But that romantic tradition was absolutely important. Anyone interested in Tolkien should, and I think it's online, should read his essay on fairy stories
Mm-hmm.
from 1939. Right, that's where he lays it all out. And that essay is very much based on Coleridge's literary theory and his worldview. And Tolkien was very, very clear about that. He drew his whole idea of the creation of secondary worlds as a religious act. He drew that straight from Coleridge. Um, and he drew a lot of his ideas about the dignity of handicraft labor and about individual agency from Ruskin. And Morris was, his absolute inspiration, particularly the part of Morris nobody seems to read anymore, which are his Icelandic romances, I guess you'd call them. I'm not quite sure if they're called novels, but The House of the Wolf. I mean, the titles are so Tolkien, The House of the Wolfings, The Roots of the Mountains, The Wood Beyond the World. All these things that Morris wrote in the 1880s, they were hugely influential on Tolkien, enough to make him learn Old Icelandic. He learned lots of old languages, but, and one of the reasons he ends up actually writing The Hobbit and then The Lord of the Rings, he's composing his world and the Silmarillion, but the reason he enters kind of the publications that get him out there is in part because his friend C.S. Lewis says to him, we're going to have to write the books we want to read because nobody else is doing it. And that's a discussion that comes out of Morris. So yeah, he's definitely rooted there.
Okay, that's fantastic. And then, Morris is, I'm going to go back to this idea of reintegration because I forgot to pick it up, which is I hadn't really thought of that definition of romanticism before. Certainly it fits Emerson and Thoreau
Mhm.
perfectly. And then with Hawthorne and Melville, I would say they're more like obsessed with the desire for and yet impossibility of reintegration. So it's the same
Mhm.
thing. Humankind needs to be reintegrated, and Melville's like, good luck with that. Like, to not want reintegration, I think for Melville is crazy, and then to believe in reintegration in the midst of industrial society is also crazy, I think, for Melville. So you've just been thinking about Melville for a long time, and you've helped me so much with that. And then,
I
of
think
course, go
Tolkien
ahead.
would fit in there. Sorry,
Yes, no, go right ahead.
because if I I have a seminar with undergraduates at LSU called "Saving the World," the British hero in popular culture. And we do Lord of the Rings, the Meredith Veldman edited version. J.R.R. Tolkien would be horrified. So, Reader's Digest condensed version. But afterwards, the students always say, "Wow, in the end, this is actually a really sad book." And I said, "Yes, it is," because he was a really sad man because he didn't think short of heaven that we can be reintegrated. And the thing is, the elves leave in the end, and Middle Earth is passing, and even though the Shire is cleansed, we all know that's not going to last very long. And evil will come back. So, through his very Catholic religious frame, I think he too is saying this is what we all long for, but we're fallen and we will never get it short of death.
Look, again, so this goes to the heart of this version of anarchy and then Christianity. So one of the big questions, maybe the biggest question about Jesus, is was he trying to say that heaven was a place on earth that could be achieved through anarchy, through throwing away property and family and reintegrating into this almost almost inconceivably tight-knit community? Or was the claim, as has been broadly understood at least since Augustine, if not the Apostle Paul,
Yeah.
is the claim that this community cannot be found on earth, and you can sort of temporarily simulate it, but ultimately the only way to have the gentle anarchy of heaven is through the apocalypse, the extinguishing of this world, and being beyond. Now, again, this is going to be repetition for some people, but for my money, the first anarchist is not Godwin, it's Winstanley. As long as you believe, let's say the first modern anarchist, if you're willing to start the modern world a little bit earlier than Kropotkin and Hobsbawm are willing to do, then the first modern anarchists are coming out of the English Revolution, not the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. And Winstanley, reintegration. He calls it digging, but it could be reintegration. We are a community. We are together. We are going to grow, and we are going to eat what we grow. And he is absolutely explicit. Heaven is a place on earth. Jesus commanded us to make it right here and now. We are not waiting for the perfect heaven. We're going to make it here, and it can be perfect as long as we all agree. And of course, it falls apart, immediately. Not just because of opposition from the state, but also because the people do not behave the way Winstanley wants them to. And so this does seem to me to be a huge break between. So if I've been saying there's a straight line, and I can see a straight line from Winstanley to Morris to Tolkien in this idea of reintegration, but the idea that, and this is where Winstanley is in a certain way, Winstanley's totally backwards looking, but he's also a progressive in that he says, there used to be a Garden of Eden and let's make a new one.
Mm-hmm.
Tolkien, I think the thing that really sticks in people's craw when I say that he is an anarchist is Morris, for a while, tried to build a new world in which this reintegration could happen for everyone. Tolkien did not. It seems that he probably...
No, he would have rejected it absolutely completely, and that's what I mean. Not only not an ideology, but a worldview, a set of presuppositions, but it can lead in so many directions. And a lot of it has to do, the different directions have to do with, do you see human beings as fundamentally good or not? And Tolkien would not. They're not. And so something like Winstanley's efforts are going to fail because that form of reintegration is no longer available to us. like I said, I mean, he's not only looking at it as romantic, he's also a very conservative Roman Catholic. Uh, and I think, right, so you end up in a very different set of political or this worldly attitudes. So for him, the retreat into a world of literature, the retreat into ancient languages, was well, what he calls the escape of the prisoner. Right?
Mhm.
It's not the flight of the deserter. It's the escape of the prisoner. I'm imprisoned in this world, and until I can get back to the right place, this is going to be my reality. And lucky for us, the result is the Lord of the Rings, which is such a powerful work and has been used in so many different contexts. That the symbolic potential of that work, I think, just continues to amaze me. I mean, that company that does all the spyware stuff that's really dangerous, Palantir.
Palantir, yeah.
I mean, that's what you think. Whoa. you know, the precise thing that Tolkien would have been utterly horrified by. It just continues to amaze me, the
Yeah.
reach of his language.
Yeah. I mean, this wasn't one of the things I was planning on talking about, but it is worth talking about. And I've gotten emails about Tolkien and the Italian fascists. I'm
Yeah,
aware of that connection. I can't see it myself. I mean, I can't see it. I can't see why someone who likes Mussolini and Marinetti would like Tolkien. It seems. I mean, if you're not familiar with Marinetti, Marinetti is one of the earliest modernists. He's part of this movement called Futurism, and the futurists make amazing art and they inspire Dada and surrealism. They're really part of the mainstream of modernist visual art and highly influential on socialists and on and anarchist art as we understand it. And but I mean, they're futurists. They love the future. They love technology. And when World War I happens, I cannot think of anyone literally in the entire world. I've never read anyone besides Marinetti who is just like, this is fantastic.
yeah,
He
yeah.
like the he's like all of this metal flying through the air, obliterating people. I look at it and it is the future. And to think that,
Energy.
yeah,
Yeah,
that this man who becomes a fascist and is one of the chief cultural figures in fascism, to think that you could admire him and Tolkien, I didn't know this, I'm reading the letters now, during the Battle of Britain, or at least shortly thereafter, is like, I hate the RAF. I know I'm glad that they're protecting us, but oh my God, the existence of airplanes is the worst thing that ever
yeah. Yeah,
happened.
he compares him to the Nazgul.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. In the letters to his son, who is in the RAF,
Yes.
which is, yeah, well, I mean, again, fascism, I mean, and the Nazism, sort of the wing of fascism, the strong state that wouldn't obviously work with anarchy, but there is a romantic element, certainly, I think, much stronger in Nazism than in fascism, but it's there. Both fascism and Nazism were these conglomerations of all kinds of different political tendencies and contradictory thoughts. But I think we have to acknowledge that a lot of those ideas found themselves in very unsavory places. And you do have this wing of Tolkien adopters who who I think are attracted by his rejection of the modern world, but also by the fact that in the end there is a war, and there is that clear hierarchy, and there sure aren't very many women. Those kind of elements coming through. But yeah, the adoption on the far right is well, it's very pronounced. It's clearly there. And you compare that to, there's a whole strand of punk bands in England who are very Tolkien-esque, and you just try and imagine these people coming together, you know.
Yeah.
But it should be said, during the Spanish Civil War, Tolkien was a strong supporter of Franco because of the Catholic connection.
Mm-hmm. And I think also, I continue to not have had my episode on the Spanish Civil War because it just hasn't come out. Maybe it should be a dozen episodes, but it also strikes me. I mean, I've read the letters, and I think the Catholic thing makes by far the most sense. But if we understand the Spanish Civil War the way we often understand it, as sort of a fight between fascism and liberal democracy, then it becomes supporting Franco seems nonsense. But if you understand it, say the way Orwell describes it, I know this is a famous, people have argued about this. Orwell says, I was taught it was a fight between fascism and liberal democracy, but I got there and I discovered it was a true out and out bottom up left wing revolution. And if you think of it as a sort of a right wing military government, a sort of we can't say Trump anymore, right? But a sort of John McCain government versus a actual, like Pancho Villa or Zapata uprising, you can imagine a lot of modern quote liberals, in whichever way you want to use that term, would be more comfortable with John McCain in charge of Spain than with Zapata in charge of Spain.
Yeah.
That if you can see it that way, it's like, yeah, I get it. I mean, look, I've got an anarchist podcast. You know who I'm picking in that side, but there's a great many of your friends and neighbors would rather have a center-right militaristic authoritarian than the destruction of their current civilization and its replacement with a working class revolution. I don't think that's a controversial
right. No, and I mean, for Tolkien, I think it was there was a Catholic who was defending the church, and there were people killing nuns and priests, so that was very clear. And also, after the war ended, he was very much against the Labour government and the formation of a welfare state in Britain. I mean, that's where I guess, you could trace certain elements of his anarchy. He didn't like a regulatory state. He didn't like an intervening state, even if it meant, feeding children, even if it meant ensuring access to educational opportunities for kids. He would prefer a much smaller state. And he was a very apolitical person. He was not very socially aware. I think the Civil War, the Spanish Civil War, came within his remit probably through going to church.
Mm-hmm.
And I would imagine there were sermons about the atrocities happening against Catholics in Spain. And that would be where he would have gotten it, because he wasn't a man who sat down and read the paper or anything.
Yeah, I mean, I have great sympathy with the left side on the Spanish Civil War, but when I was in Barcelona, and you want to see the plans of the Sagrada Familia, and Gaudi is, to me, pretty much a Catholic anarchist, of which there are many, but you can't see the plans of the Sagrada Familia because the anarchists burned them. So, like that. If that's what you see, if that's what you think anarchy is, the murder and destruction of the people in power, then of course Tolkien's going to be against it.
Absolutely.
I do just need to go back again because we mentioned Palantir, we didn't discuss it. This is, I went on at length about Marinetti and the irony of someone liking both Tolkien and Marinetti, but yeah, Palantir is worse. Palantir, if you haven't read The Lord of the Rings, those of you out there, is these orbs which they were built with good intentions to be able to see and communicate, and then they were turned by powerful people into weapons of control. Literally, Palantir is a Peter Thiel company designed to take the internet, which was designed for communication and seeing, and turn it into a weapon of control. So he's named it perfectly. How one is supposed to reconcile that he did this as a fan of the Lord of the... Does he not understand that if you use a Palantir for that person, for that purpose, you are Saruman. You are Sauron. You are the villain of the story. I can't. I mean, I'm not asking you to speculate on Peter Thiel, but how these? I mean, that I try and have the most open. I'm a literary scholar. I try and be open to all readings. That is a misreading of the Lord of the Rings.
Well, I mean, as you say, it's absolutely perfect, except he doesn't seem to realize that, you know.
It's like, yes, exactly. Like
Yeah,
you named it the right thing, but that's what how can you think it's a good thing if you gave it that name?
I mean, yeah, it's like, well, let's call it Orthanc, you know. And you think, no, what? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's astonishing. So let's talk about hierarchy. Was the other thing I wanted to talk about, because when I started this podcast, I did an introductory episode, and then I did a Q&A episode, and the first time I addressed a specific topic was the Lord of the Rings. I often say it's the first episode. I mean, it's the third episode, but it's the first time that I did anything besides throat clearing and introductory work. And going through the Lord of the Rings, and I was just talking to a buddy about this who was like, yeah, I thought it was really weird that your podcast is about anarchy and you claim Tolkien is an anarchist, and the book is literally about a king taking power. When you go through the book, and I did pretty assiduously at the beginning because I had time before because I wasn't teaching, I'm not sure I can find in all three books an instance of coercion, like an order given that must be obeyed because the person who gives the order has bureaucratic or official power. That is not bad. Every, I think, instance of an order given is always with the implied consent of the person. My friend who I had on says, Aragorn is the battle commander. So if he says barricade the doors, barricade the doors. But if someone says, by order of my authority, I require you to do this, that person is Saruman or Denethor or some assorted villain.
Mm.
So there is, I think the novel, I went through it. I went through it again recently, is perfectly anarchist in its denial of coercion. And yet, as you say, it's so clear, and this is where the fascists come in, that Aragorn is a better person than many people around him. He seems to be a better person in large part because of his lineage. He literally has,
Yeah.
kingly heritage. And we are just we just accept in Tolkien's world that everyone will consent to Aragorn by nature. I mean, he's radiant with natural authority. So first of all, I want to see if you think I'm right that like coercion doesn't really exist, and then secondly, what are we to make of this? Tolkien doesn't have to have coercion because he can imagine a world in which aristocracy, in its true sense, rule by the best,
Right.
flows naturally and doesn't ever seem to become oligarchy.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that is it, because he's drawing on the other theme of romanticism, which is this use of the Middle Ages as this very symbolic reservoir, and of course in the Middle Ages the idea of the king is there is, in a sense, divinity flowing through them, or at least God's symbol there, and it is natural authority and it is right authority, and you don't need coercion because everyone recognizes it. Just like in the Arthurian legend, when young Arthur has the sword, then you're going to obey him because everyone can see the authority there. So it's completely, obviously, contrary to any logic or reason or modern understanding, but by setting it in this medievalist world, all of a sudden it makes perfect sense, right? The right one is there. And yes, I agree. All coercion is not, I was thinking of when the hobbits come back to the Shire and there are all those notices put up by order of the chief, right? And they go tearing them all down. And any bureaucracy and any kind of rules, and if you think of the Shire, there's the king is this faraway thing, even once Aragorn comes back. and Sam ends up as mayor, but you don't have this sense that like the mayor does anything, they just all meet in the pub. And so everybody rules their own little life. And that is clearly Tolkien's ideal. Um, like he recognized it was important, but he really resented the wartime regulations during World War II, which, I mean, were incredibly invasive. How much water you could put in your tub, how much food you could buy. He really resented that and saw that there was the seed of a kind of tyranny of the democratic state. Coming in saying, I'm going to make this better, I'm going to make it more equal, but then intervening in people's lives. So yeah, I think that's how he squares the circle. Is you have this medievalist monarch to whom the hobbits pay homage, but then of course Aragorn pays homage to them as the ones who saved the world, and then they go off back to their shire where there isn't really a king. There's just hobbits. And of course that's Tolkien, right? I mean, he was pretty open about his identification with the hobbits.
Yes, in his letters, he's always describing himself as hobbit-like, except
Yeah,
in
yeah,
in stature. Yeah, no, I think it makes sense that it's a medievalist fantasy. I, I like to imagine, and of course, Ursula Le Guin does this in The Dispossessed, but not in her, fantasy of Earthsea. I like to imagine a Tolkien who could write a world without a king. But I think that's a political stance of a
mm-hmm.
kind that he wasn't as in other words, I just learned this from you. He wasn't His letters are filled with sort of political philosophy of the Lord of the Rings, but it's usually in response either to A, of someone writing him and asking him a question, or B, exactly as you say, political decisions are being made in his life that are affecting him and he doesn't like it. And so he writes to
Yeah,
Christopher, I don't like airplanes, I don't like government restrictions. And then, I mean, I guess at this point I just need to say, like, this is an incredibly common argument I have as someone who is, a good liberal Democrat and also a philosophical anarchist with my friends who are just like, why do you hate clean water, Graham? Don't you know the state needs to regulate that? I'm like, well, so someone needs to make sure the water is clean. I agree with that, but I tend to incline to the somewhat anarchic view that if you create a giant water bureaucracy, then you're going to have a lot of bad things come along with that. And then the big question, this is the William Morris question that again is familiar to listeners of the show. Morris solves this problem by not having big
right.
things in news from nowhere. So the
Mhm.
question, and this is what The Dispossessed is about. So it seems pretty easy to have an anarcho primitivist world in which everyone has clean water because everyone lives near a spring and there's
Right.
always a neighbor helping out, and the world population is 1 billion and there's no factories. So that's easy. The question is whether we can have a world with, Kropotkin talks about a world with good small factories and clean water without a state. That's not Morris's vision, and that's just so far from Tolkien's concern. He has no interest in that. But what I'm trying to say is, and this is the shocking, scandalous thing, is I like the federal income tax. Like the federal income tax created this enormous bureaucracy in the United States, and you're just supposed to celebrate that wholly as an unalloyed good if are voting for a Democrat in 2025. But David Graeber was like, really, like, do we need this big of a bureaucracy around money? And the answer is, if you have giant corporations, you do need
Yeah.
one bureaucracy to fight another bureaucracy. But I read Tolkien and I think maybe the Shire would. I don't want to live in Gondor, but I do want to live in the Shire. And that's when someone calls you a romantic, right? And
Yeah. Right.
they
Right.
don't mean a reader of Keats and Shelley. That is not what they mean when they call
No,
you
no.
a romantic.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, it is very tough. If you look at the history of Britain in through the Industrial Revolution, people who culturally and historically were against any kind of overweening central power since Cromwell, and the triumph of laissez-faire and utilitarianism. But by the end of the 19th century, you actually have quite the nucleus of what becomes the welfare state, because of just the problems of modern urban living. But the most effective solutions came at the civic level. What the British called municipal socialism. It wasn't really socialism, it was just communities taking charge. So Birmingham taking charge of the water, Manchester taking charge of the traffic or whatever. And I think, to go back to someone we mentioned earlier, E.F. Schumacher, the other principle I've learned from him is, actually comes because he was also a Roman Catholic, the principle of subsidiarity, that you always bring authority and action down to the lowest level, so that I, as a teacher in my classroom, should have the authority to choose what I'm teaching, that kind of thing. That is a matter of human dignity, and, in the Catholic teaching of religious right. And I think that's kind of Tolkien's vision of the Shire. And probably it's something liberal Democrats, of which I am one too, as we face this world in which we are, we need to recognize people have real grievances. And just saying the status quo is, let's get another Obama, that's not going to work.
Yeah.
That's not going to work. And we need to empower local communities. I mean, what's happening now is not doing that, but we need to empower, So if Trump were taking all that money and issuing it to local communities, but of course we know that's not happening.
Sure. Yes. I mean, I have to admit now, as in the Biden administration, I was quite happy. And I mean, even before Trump was elected, I was quite happy to agree with many sensible kind of libertarian-ish things that emanated out of the right wing. I mean, but when they said give education back to the local communities, they didn't mean it for a second. And so in some ways I was probably silly to ever say, I mean, in the same way that, when RFK criticizes the drug companies, when RFK criticizes the pharmaceutical industry and, big agriculture, I could not agree more with those critiques. But to think that to think that he's actually going to 1,000 farms are going to bloom with local produce. So but I mean, what are my options? RFK or Ezra Klein's let the corporations do whatever they want? I mean, again, take a shot of your preferred beverage of choice if you're listening to this podcast for me to complain about the Ezra Klein Abundance book again, which is just like, what's wrong with the world? Too much local control. That's basically the through line of that book is people want control over their own cities, and we need to take that away from them and let developers build whatever they want to build. If that's what the Democratic Party is selling, then again, the Shire starts to look super appealing.
Right.
The last thing I needed to ask you before we go, although I'll give you a chance to say whatever you would like first, is this question. I mean, I know that Tolkien had to flee Oxford to get away from his fans, and I know I was speaking to my friend Ruth Kenna about this, and she mentioned his distaste for the hippies, and it seems to me that it's probably pretty easy to see why he disliked the hippies, but I think it's also easy to see why the hippies liked the Shire. So if you want to, I don't know, just say anything about this, it's another contradiction that I'm asking you to make sense of.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the Lord of the Rings does not become a phenomenon until sort of the 60s, as we call it, right? Um, and suddenly people find, all these resonances, which of course they should. And part of my book is then looking at the Green Movement, which wasn't called the Green Movement at the time, but and people definitely reaching back to a lot of Tolkien's ideas and finding again this symbolic resonance. I mean, once you know about orcs, you have such a great symbol for, as all of us see, the degradation around us. I mean, Tolkien was a man of his generation, so of course the hippies were beyond him. He was a very conservative Roman Catholic. He was a man who believed in what he would have thought of as natural social hierarchies, including quite a gendered hierarchy.
Yes.
Uh, and so, yeah, much of, again, the symbolic 60s simply horrified him. And I would think, yeah, having fans at his house. On the one hand, he was delighted to be read. He really was. And he was delighted that people understood some of what he was saying. So there's the famous picture of him in the roots of a tree, kind of. And he says, I'm always on the side of the trees. And he liked that people got that, But sure, the cultural clash there between what he stood for and what a lot of his readers then embraced, I think it was pretty overwhelming.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems like I can imagine Tolkien and the Woodstock people getting along in the Shire. If they were all in the Shire together,
Right,
right? I
right.
can't imagine them getting along when one of them. I mean, because the Shire does not have Oxford, it does not have Roman Catholicism, it does not
Mhm.
have these. The conservatism of the Shire is all 100% small c everyday conservatism, and I'm all for this form, the conservatism of knowing your neighbors, the conservatism of growing food near you, the conservatism of walking. If progress means flying through the air while fiddling with a device so that you can argue with strangers, then I am not
Right.
a progressive, right? But there's big capital C conservatism in Tolkien's life as
Mhm.
well, and the hippies like the small c conservatism. I mean, just listen to a hippie talk about growing pot, and you will find that they are also friends of the trees, right?
Right, right.
But they probably also want to spray paint Oxford, if not out and out
Yeah.
Molotov cocktail. Well, they're probably too high to do that. But anyways, they're definitely the hippies are hanging out with the SDSers who want to burn Oxford to the ground and probably want there to be no more Catholic Church. And
Yes. Right.
that's not
Absolutely.
going to do
And
it.
and he had an intellectual hierarchy as well. And so the the traditions, the rituals of Oxford, as well as of monarchy, those meant a great deal to him. And you can see that in the Lord of the Rings. He believes in tradition and ritual and all of that. And so that element of the 60s of burn it down, tear it down. And he also believe, the whole argument over the canon would have been. This is a man who was really angry that when they took away the rule that everyone had to learn Anglo-Saxon. So
Yeah, and it seems that Morris, I mean, it's like, again, romanticism as a slur is like Morris romanticized the Middle Ages. It does seem that, and I've read plenty of Morris compared to the average person, but not that much compared to a Morris scholar. It seems that Morris sidesteps
yeah,
this monarchical. I mean, he writes beautifully and I think persuasively that the Middle Ages were much less hierarchical than we think of. The average peasant is not interacting with, coercive power anywhere near as much as we interact with coercive power in our day-to-day life. The average peasant has more control over their life than you do if you go to work. Like, he writes very persuasively about that. He doesn't seem to mention too often when the taxpayer does come and
Right.
maybe burns down the peasant's house. That just does not come up in Morris, does it?
No. And I mean, neither does Black Death.
Yeah. Yeah, this is, another way of putting this, I was speaking with a friend, I guess I'll say my friend John McGowan, because he's been on the podcast a few times, and, and he said basically what you're arguing for, Graham, I mean, I was trying to make a sort of Morris argument, is you're arguing for the Middle Ages without the bad parts.
Right.
And, I think the average progressive is trying to argue for industrial society without the bad parts. And at this current juncture, it seems to me more likely that we could have a nice Middle Ages style world and figure out a way to make insulin and vaccines and grow enough food than that we could have a giant technocratic conurbation and figure out a way for people to have enough trees and clean air and not be surrounded by chemicals and smartphones. Of those two, a modernized Middle Ages strikes me as more plausible than a greened techno world. But I can't prove this. This is just a matter of taste, perhaps a romantic sensibility. Perhaps we're back where we started.
Absolutely.
Okay, Meredith, this has been such a pleasure. Anything else you would like to share before we go?
No. But no, it's great. It's always fun to, how often you get to talk about ideas like this,
Well, I try and do it. I try and do it every week. That's my goal.
Absolutely.
Every other week coming soon. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. It was such a pleasure.
All right. Thank you.